What if everything you've heard about Atlantis sinking slowly is wrong? Ancient texts speak of something far more terrifying, a destruction so sudden that an entire civilization vanished before the sun rose again. Thoth claimed Atlantis did not fade away over years. It was erased in a single night. No warnings, no escape, just chaos. Imagine cities of crystal, glowing with knowledge, suddenly swallowed by darkness as the ground itself began to shake. According to Thoth, the people of Atlantis thought they were untouchable. Their power, their wisdom, their technology, they believed it made them gods. But one night, the skies changed. The oceans moved in ways never seen before, and a decision made by the rulers of Atlantis triggered something catastrophic, a mistake or a betrayal that doomed them all. The streets that once shimmered with golden light became rivers of panic. Priests who had spent lifetimes chanting harmony now shouted orders that no one could follow. Families clung to each other as tremors rattled the foundations of their homes. The rulers, proud and defiant, insisted that their machines could control the chaos, but the machines only roared louder, amplifying the destruction. Thoth described the moment as a symphony of disaster, lightning splitting the heavens, thunder rolling like drums of war, and the ocean surging forward with a fury that no wall could withstand. The Atlanteans, who believed themselves invincible, realized too late that their brilliance had become their curse. Some accounts even add a touch of humor to the tragedy. Rival generals argued over whose machine had summoned the storm, boasting absurdly as the skies burned above them. Citizens, bewildered, wondered if the gods were staging a festival, only to discover that the festival was their final night. The fall of Atlantis was not a slow decline, but a sudden erasure. A continent that had touched the stars vanished before dawn, leaving only silence and legend. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know where you're watching from. I bet someone's tuning in from their bed pretending to sleep, while another is secretly listening at work, hoping the boss doesn't notice their deep dive into Atlantis. The night after Atlantis's rulers made their fateful choice, the heavens began to stir in ways that unsettled even the most devoted priests. Above the glittering towers, stars flickered with an unnatural rhythm, their positions trembling as though the sky itself had grown restless. Clouds gathered in spirals, glowing faintly as if lit from within. Streaks of lightning cut across the horizon without the thunder that should have followed. Thoth described these signs as the first undeniable warning. The balance between earth and sky had been broken. The heavens were signaling that catastrophe was near. Yet the people, confident in their mastery of knowledge, dismissed the spectacle. They believed their sciences explained everything, and so they ignored what was unfolding above them. The skies grew heavier, the colors deepened, and the silence between flashes of light became more ominous. It was not a celebration, nor a natural storm. It was a declaration that the harmony of Atlantis had been disturbed. The heavens were no longer passive, they were preparing to act. Priests whispered of danger, but their voices were drowned out by the pride of rulers. Rulers insisted that the skies were merely reflecting the brilliance of their machines. Citizens gazed upward with awe, convinced that the heavens were applauding their greatness. In truth, the heavens were warning them that their time was ending. The warning from the sky was unmistakable, but arrogance blinded the people. They looked upward and saw beauty, not danger. They believed themselves untouchable, and in that belief they sealed their fate. Atlantis stood as a beacon of brilliance, its towers shimmering with crystalline light and its streets alive with the hum of sacred sciences. The people believed themselves untouchable, convinced that their mastery of knowledge had elevated them beyond the reach of nature itself. They healed with vibrations, built with geometry aligned to the stars, and illuminated their nights with crystals that glowed like captured suns. To them, these wonders were proof that they had become more than human. They had become gods in their own eyes. Thoth described this confidence as both dazzling and dangerous. The Atlanteans carried themselves with pride, certain that no force could challenge their dominion. Their rulers boasted of machines that could command the elements. Their priests spoke of chants that could bend the heavens, and their citizens believed that the ocean itself bowed to their will. The harmony that had once guided their civilization was overshadowed by ambition, and humility was forgotten. Signs of imbalance were already present. The earth trembled faintly beneath the crystal cities. Storms gathered without cause, and the seas shifted in ways that unsettled sailors. Yet the people dismissed these warnings. They believed their sciences explained everything, and so they ignored the growing unease. Confidence became arrogance, and arrogance became blindness. The rulers, emboldened by their power, pressed forward with experiments that stretched the limits of nature. They believed that their brilliance could not fail, that their machines would always obey, and that their wisdom would always prevail. In truth, they were standing on the edge of disaster, unaware that their pride had already set the stage for their downfall. Thoth's account makes clear that the confidence of the Atlanteans was not merely a trait, it was the very force that doomed them. Their belief in their own invincibility blinded them to the warnings of the sky, the tremors of the earth, and the restless movements of the sea. They saw themselves as gods, but the heavens and the ocean were preparing to remind them that they were mortal. Atlantis had risen to heights unmatched by any civilization before it. The people had mastered sciences that bent sound into healing vibrations, aligned geometry with the stars to build structures of perfect harmony, and harnessed crystals that glowed with energy like captured suns. These discoveries were not simply tools, they were forces that touched the very fabric of nature. Yet with each triumph, the Atlanteans grew bolder, pushing further into realms no mortal hand was meant to command. Thoth's account describes how this pursuit of power began as noble curiosity, but transformed into reckless ambition. What was once used to heal the sick and illuminate the night became twisted into experiments of dominance. Crystals were tuned to frequencies that could shatter stone. Machines were designed to manipulate the elements, and chants, once sung for balance, were repurposed to amplify destructive energies. The rulers believed they had achieved mastery over creation itself, but in truth, they were unraveling the harmony that sustained their world. The danger lay not in the knowledge itself, but in its misuse. The Atlanteans had discovered forces that resonated with the Earth's core, energies so vast that they could stabilize or destabilize entire regions. Instead of treating these forces with reverence, they treated them as weapons. Their confidence blinded them to the risks, and their ambition silenced the voices of caution. Priests who warned of imbalance were ignored. Scholars who spoke of restraint were dismissed, and the rulers pressed forward, convinced that their brilliance could not fail. Thoth wrote that the power they wielded was beyond control, not because it was unknowable, but because it demanded humility they no longer possessed. The Atlanteans believed themselves gods, and in that belief they lost the wisdom to see the limits of their own creations. Their machines roared louder, their crystals glowed brighter, and their chants shook the air with unnatural force. The continent itself trembled under the weight of their ambition. The seeds of destruction had been sown. Power without balance had become the defining trait of Atlantis, and the forces they unleashed were no longer theirs to command. The harmony that had sustained their civilization was broken, and the earth, the sky, and the ocean were preparing to respond. Atlantis was not destroyed without warning. Long before the final night, the land and sea began to reveal subtle signs that balance had been broken. The earth trembled faintly beneath the crystal city's vibrations that priests recognized as unnatural. Storms gathered without cause, clouds forming in spirals that seemed to defy the natural order. The ocean shifted in ways that unsettled sailors, tides rising and falling unpredictably, waves striking with unusual force even on calm days. Thoth recorded these signs as clear messages from nature, signals that harmony had been disturbed. Yet the people of Atlantis, blinded by confidence, dismissed them. To the rulers, the tremors were insignificant, mere quirks of the earth. To the citizens, the restless tides were curiosities, nothing more than unusual weather. Even the priests, who spoke of imbalance, were silenced by leaders who insisted that their sciences explained everything. The warnings grew louder. Crystals that once glowed steadily began to flicker, their energies unstable. Machines roared with greater force, sometimes failing without reason. Farmers noticed that crops grew unevenly, as if the soil itself had lost its rhythm. Animals fled the forests, birds abandoned their nests, and fish swam erratically near the shores. These were not coincidences. They were signs that the natural order was unraveling. Still, the people ignored them. Festivals continued, experiments pressed forward, and the rulers boasted of their brilliance. The signs were treated as distractions, inconveniences that did not deserve attention. Pride silenced caution, and arrogance blinded wisdom. Thoth's account makes clear that the fall of Atlantis was not sudden in its cause, only in its final moment. The signs had been present, visible to all who cared to look, but they were ignored. The people believed themselves untouchable, convinced that their knowledge made them gods. In truth, they were mortals, standing on the edge of disaster, blind to the warnings that surrounded them. Long before the final night, the ocean began to reveal its unrest. Sailors noticed that tides no longer followed their familiar rhythm. Waves rose higher than expected, striking the shores with unusual force even when the skies were calm. Currents shifted unpredictably, carrying ships off course and confusing navigators who had relied on the sea's patterns for generations. Thoth described these changes as the ocean's voice, a warning that balance had been broken. The waters grew restless. Fishermen reported that shoals of fish moved erratically, sometimes vanishing altogether, while others appeared in places they had never been seen before. The sea seemed alive with agitation, as though it sensed the energies being unleashed upon the land. The rulers dismissed these reports, insisting that their machines could explain and control such phenomena. Citizens treated the strange tides as curiosities, inconveniences that disrupted trade, but nothing more. Yet the ocean's behavior grew increasingly violent. Swells rose without storms, whirlpools appeared suddenly near the coasts, and the sound of waves carried an unnatural resonance. echoing against the cliffs with a force that unsettled those who listened closely. Priests warned that the ocean was responding to the misuse of sacred sciences. The resonance of crystals and experiments had disturbed the harmony between land and sea, but their warnings were ignored, drowned out by the pride of leaders who believed themselves masters of nature. The strange ocean behavior was not random. It was the first movement of a force preparing to reclaim balance. The waters were gathering strength, waiting for the moment when they would rise against Atlantis. The people, blinded by arrogance, saw only inconvenience where they should have seen danger. The ocean had begun its march toward destruction, and Atlantis was too proud to listen. As the signs of imbalance grew stronger, the fate of Atlantis rested in the hands of its rulers. They had been warned by priests who spoke of the heavens shifting, by sailors who described the ocean's strange behavior, and by scholars who noted the tremors beneath the crystal cities. Yet pride clouded their judgment. The rulers believed that their mastery of sacred sciences gave them dominion over nature itself, and they refused to accept that their creations could be the cause of such unrest. Thoth's account reveals that the rulers gathered in their great halls, debating not whether to stop their experiments, but how to push them further. They saw the instability of the crystals not as danger, but as opportunity. Machines that roared with unnatural force were praised as proof of progress. The warnings of imbalance were dismissed as superstition, relics of an older age that no longer applied to their enlightened society. The final decision was made. The experiments would continue. The rulers believed that by amplifying the energies they had harnessed, they could stabilize the continent. In truth, they were feeding the very forces that threatened to consume them. The resonance of their machines reached deeper into the earth, disturbing its core, while the vibrations of their crystals echoed into the sea, unsettling its tides. This decision was not born of ignorance, but of arrogance. The rulers knew the risks, yet they believed themselves untouchable. They saw themselves as gods, convinced that no force could challenge their brilliance. Their choice sealed the fate of Atlantis, setting into motion the chain of events that would lead to its destruction. Thoth described this moment as the turning point. The ruler's final decision was not simply an error. It was the act that doomed an entire civilization. By refusing to listen to the warnings of nature, they ensured that the earth, the sky, and the ocean would rise together in a single night of chaos. Atlantis, once a beacon of harmony, had chosen pride over wisdom, and the consequences would be swift and absolute. The rulers of Atlantis believed their mastery of energy was the pinnacle of human achievement. Crystals tuned to precise frequencies glowed with immense power. Machines resonated with vibrations that could heal or destroy, and chance amplified forces that reached deep into the earth. These discoveries were meant to sustain life, to bring harmony between humanity and nature. Yet, ambition twisted them into something far more dangerous. Thoth's account describes how the experiments began with noble intent, but quickly spiraled into reckless pursuits. The rulers sought to amplify the energies they had harnessed, convinced that greater power would secure their dominance. Crystals were pushed beyond their natural limits. Machines were forced to roar with unnatural intensity, and frequencies were tuned to levels that destabilized rather than balanced. What had once been tools of healing became instruments of imbalance. The first failures were subtle. Crystals flickered instead of glowing steadily, their light unstable. Machines faltered, producing vibrations that shook the ground rather than calming it. Priests noticed that chants no longer harmonized with the heavens, instead echoing with discord. Farmers saw crops wither unexpectedly, and animals fled from regions where experiments were conducted. These were not accidents. They were warnings that the forces being manipulated were slipping beyond control. Still, the rulers pressed forward. They believed that by amplifying the energies further, they could stabilize the continent. They sought to prove their supremacy. In truth, they were feeding instability. The resonance of their machines reached deeper into the earth, disturbing its core, while the vibrations of their crystals echoed into the sea, unsettling its tides. Each experiment pushed Atlantis closer to disaster. Thoth wrote that these experiments were the turning point. They were not simply errors of science, but acts of arrogance. Choices made by leaders who believed themselves gods. The energies they unleashed were vast, demanding humility and restraint. Yet they treated them as weapons and tools of pride. The experiments went wrong not because the knowledge was flawed, but because wisdom had been abandoned. The consequences were inevitable. The forces they had awakened were no longer theirs to command. The earth trembled, the ocean grew restless, and the skies prepared to respond. Atlantis had crossed the threshold, and the path to destruction had been set. The fall of Atlantis did not begin with the great wave or the storming skies. It began quietly, with tremors beneath the ground that spread like whispers through the crystal cities. At first, they were subtle. A faint vibration felt underfoot, a shiver that passed unnoticed by many. But those who listened closely knew the earth was speaking, warning that balance had been broken. Thoth described these tremors as the first physical response to the misuse of sacred sciences. The resonance of crystals, pushed beyond their natural limits, had reached into the Earth's core. Machines designed to amplify energy shook the foundations of the land, disturbing forces that had remained stable for centuries. The harmony between humanity and nature was unraveling, and the ground itself began to reveal the truth. The tremors grew stronger. Streets cracked, temples swayed, and towers that had stood for generations shuddered under the strain. Citizens fled into the open plazas, bewildered by the sudden instability. Priests raised chants to calm the earth, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of machines that continued to hum with unnatural force. The rulers insisted that the tremors were temporary, dismissing them as minor disturbances that their sciences could control. In reality, the continent was beginning to fracture. Farmers reported fissures opening in the fields, swallowing crops, and splitting irrigation channels. Merchants found their warehouses shaking, goods tumbling from shelves as the vibrations intensified. Families clung to one another as their homes rattled, walls cracking and ceilings collapsing. The tremors were no longer whispers. They were declarations that the land itself was rebelling. Thoth's account makes clear that these tremors were not accidents. They were the direct consequence of experiments gone wrong. The Earth's response to energies that had been forced beyond balance. The people of Atlantis, blinded by pride, refused to see the danger. They believed themselves untouchable, convinced that their brilliance could overcome any challenge. But the ground beneath them told another story, one of instability, imbalance, and impending collapse. The first tremors were the beginning of the end. They marked the moment when Atlantis crossed the threshold from harmony into chaos, when the land itself began to prepare for the destruction that would soon follow. The tremors that had begun as whispers grew into violent quakes, shaking the very foundations of Atlantis. Streets cracked open, towers swayed dangerously, and temples that had stood for centuries began to crumble. The crystal cities, once radiant with harmony, were thrown into chaos. Citizens poured into the plazas, their voices rising in fear as the ground beneath them split apart. Thoth described the scene as a wave of panic spreading faster than the tremors themselves. Families clung to one another, unsure whether to flee or remain. Merchants abandoned their goods, watching helplessly as warehouses collapsed. Priests attempted chants to restore balance, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of machines. Machines that continued to hum with unstable energy. The rulers, still blinded by pride, insisted that the situation was under control, but their words carried no weight against the destruction unfolding around them. The crystal towers, symbols of Atlantis's brilliance, became hazards. Their glowing structures flickered erratically, shards breaking away and crashing into the streets below. Bridges that connected districts snapped under the strain, sending people tumbling into the waters that surged through the city. Panic spread as citizens realized that the very wonders they had trusted for protection were now collapsing around them. The tremors intensified, splitting the ground into jagged fissures that swallowed homes and marketplaces. Fires broke out as energy conduits ruptured, filling the air with smoke and ash. The once orderly streets became rivers of confusion, with thousands fleeing in every direction, desperate to escape the chaos. The sound of panic cries, collapsing stone, and the relentless rumble of the earth echoed through the night. Thoth's account makes clear that this panic was not simply fear of the unknown. It was the realization that the Atlanteans' confidence had betrayed them. The sciences they had trusted, the machines they had built, and the crystals they had worshipped as symbols of power were now the very forces tearing their world apart. The crystal cities, once the pride of Atlantis, had become the stage for its downfall. The tremors that had shaken Atlantis grew into something far more devastating. What began as vibrations beneath the feet of citizens became violent ruptures that tore through the land itself. Streets cracked wide open, splitting marketplaces and temples in two. The once stable ground of the crystal cities betrayed its people, opening fissures that swallowed homes, crops, and entire districts. Thoth described this moment as the Earth's cry of rebellion. The resonance of crystals and the roar of machines had disturbed forces buried deep within the continent. The harmony that had sustained Atlantis for centuries was broken, and the land responded with fury. Towers that had stood for generations collapsed as their foundations crumbled. Bridges snapped, sending people plunging into the waters below. Plazas filled with terrified citizens became scenes of chaos as the ground split beneath them. The rulers, still clinging to pride, insisted that their sciences could restore stability. They ordered machines to counteract the tremors, but the machines only amplified the destruction. The vibrations they produced resonated with the fissures, widening them further and accelerating the collapse. Priests raised chants to calm the earth, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of stone breaking and the cries of thousands fleeing for their lives. Families clung to one another as their homes disintegrated. Merchants abandoned their goods, watching helplessly as warehouses crumbled into dust. Farmers saw entire fields vanish into the earth, swallowed by chasms that opened without warning. The crystal towers, once symbols of brilliance, shattered into fragments that rained down upon the streets. Thoth's account makes clear that this was the moment when Atlantis crossed from panic into despair. The ground itself had turned against its people, and no force could stop it. The continent was fracturing, its foundations collapsing under the weight of arrogance and misuse of power. The Atlanteans, who had believed themselves untouchable, now faced the truth. Their brilliance had become their curse. The splitting of the ground was not the end, but it was the sign that the end was near. The earth had spoken, and its voice was final. Atlantis was breaking apart, and nothing could hold it together. The earth had split, the skies had roared, and the ocean had grown restless. All of these forces converged into a single moment, the rising of the great wave. Thoth described it as the final act of nature's rebellion, a wall of water so immense that it blotted out the horizon. It did not come gradually, nor with mercy. It rose suddenly, towering above the crystal cities, a force beyond comprehension. The people of Atlantis saw it too late, as the tremors shook the land and fires spread through the streets. The ocean gathered its strength. The strange tides and whirlpools that had plagued sailors were only preludes to this moment. The waters surged upward, pulled by energies disturbed deep within the earth, and formed a wave that stretched across the coastline. Its roar was deafening, a sound that silenced cries and chants alike. Citizens fled toward higher ground, but the wave was faster than their steps. Towers that had once glowed with crystalline light were swallowed whole, their fragments carried away in the torrent. Temples collapsed as the waters surged through their foundations, and marketplaces vanished beneath the flood. Ships anchored in the harbors were lifted like toys, hurled against the cliffs, shattered into splinters. Thoth wrote that the great wave was not simply water, it was judgment. It carried the weight of imbalance, the fury of nature responding to arrogance. The rulers, who had believed themselves gods, stood powerless as the ocean erased their brilliance. Machines sputtered and failed, crystals dimmed and shattered, and chants dissolved into silence. The wave consumed everything, leaving no refuge, no sanctuary, no escape. The great wave was the culmination of every warning ignored, every experiment pushed too far, every act of pride that defied harmony. It was the ocean reclaiming balance, sweeping away a civilization that had forgotten humility. When it receded, Atlantis was no more. The continent that had touched the stars had vanished beneath the sea, leaving only legend and silence. When the great wave had passed, and the fires of the storm had burned themselves out, a heavy darkness fell upon Atlantis. The once radiant towers, shattered and submerged, no longer glowed with crystalline light. The streets that had been alive with voices and movement lay silent beneath the waters. What remained was not simply ruin, but a shadow that seemed to stretch across the ocean itself. Thoth described this darkness as more than the absence of light. It was the weight of imbalance, the echo of pride that had led to destruction. The skies, once filled with stars, were veiled in ash and storm clouds. The ocean, restless and vast, covered the land with a silence that felt eternal. The brilliance of Atlantis had been extinguished, leaving only fragments buried beneath the waves. Survivors, scattered across distant lands, carried with them memories of despair. They spoke of the moment when the light of their civilization was swallowed, when harmony vanished into shadow. Some preserved fragments of Atlantean knowledge, but none could restore what had been lost. The darkness was not only physical, it was a reminder etched into their hearts that arrogance had destroyed their home. The rulers who had believed themselves gods were gone, their voices silenced by the storm. The machines that had roared with power lay broken beneath the sea. The crystals that had glowed with brilliance were dimmed forever. Atlantis, once a beacon of harmony, had become a legend of ruin. Thoth's account makes clear that this darkness was not meant to be forgotten. It was a lesson, a warning carried across generations. The fall of Atlantis was not simply the end of a continent. It was the reminder that power without humility leads only to shadow. The darkness over Atlantis was the final chapter of its pride and the beginning of its memory as myth. As the great wave rose and the skies thundered, panic consumed the crystal cities. The Atlanteans, once so confident in their mastery, now faced the truth. Their world was ending. Families clung to one another, desperate to flee, while rulers scrambled to command order amid chaos. The streets, fractured and flooded, became rivers of confusion as thousands sought escape from the destruction that surrounded them. Thoth described how some attempted to flee inland, believing the mountains would offer refuge. They climbed the trembling slopes, carrying children and possessions, only to find the ground splitting beneath their feet. Others rushed toward ships anchored in the harbors, hoping the sea might carry them to safety. But the ocean, restless and violent, was no longer a path of escape. Vessels were lifted by the surging waters, hurled against cliffs, or swallowed whole before they could sail. Priests tried to guide the people with chants, urging them to remain calm, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of the storm. The rulers, unwilling to admit defeat, ordered machines to stabilize the land. But the machines sputtered and failed, their energies feeding the chaos instead of halting it. The brilliance of Atlantis had become its curse, and every attempt to escape was met with resistance from the very forces they had once believed they controlled. A few managed to flee before the waves struck, reaching distant lands where they carried fragments of Atlantean knowledge. These survivors became the seeds of legend, whispering stories of a great civilization swallowed by the sea. Yet, for the vast majority, escape was impossible. The earth, the sky, and the ocean had united against them, closing every path of refuge. Thoth's account makes clear that the attempt to escape was not merely a struggle for survival. It was the final act of a civilization undone by pride. The Atlanteans had believed themselves gods, but in their final moments, they were mortals running from forces far greater than themselves. The attempt to escape was desperate, chaotic, and ultimately futile. Atlantis was doomed, and its people could not outrun the judgment that had come for them. When the waters closed over Atlantis, they did not only erase towers and temples, they drowned a treasury of wisdom. The Atlanteans had mastered sciences that resonated with the earth. They harnessed crystals that glowed with energy and aligned geometry with the stars to build structures of perfect harmony. These discoveries were not mere inventions. They were insights into the deepest rhythms of nature. Yet, with the fall of their civilization, much of this knowledge vanished beneath the sea. Thoth wrote that the loss was not accidental, but inevitable. The arrogance of the rulers had ensured their wisdom would not endure. Machines shattered, crystals dimmed, and scrolls of sacred writings were swept away in the flood. Libraries filled with centuries of learning collapsed into the ocean, their contents dissolved into silence. What had once been a beacon of enlightenment was reduced to fragments scattered across distant lands. Survivors carried pieces of this knowledge, but never the whole. A chant remembered here, a fragment of geometry preserved there, a tale of healing vibrations whispered across generations. These fragments became seeds of legend, inspiring myths in Egypt, Greece, and beyond. Yet the full brilliance of Atlantean science, the harmony of energies, the balance of nature, the wisdom of restraint, was lost forever. The tragedy was not only the destruction of a continent, but the erasure of understanding. Atlantis had touched truths that could have guided humanity for millennia, but pride had silenced humility, and destruction had silenced wisdom. What remained was memory, carried in stories and myths, but the knowledge itself was gone. Thoth's account makes clear that this loss was the greatest consequence of Atlantis's fall. Towers could be rebuilt, cities could rise again, but the wisdom that had been drowned could never be fully recovered. Knowledge lost forever became the true legacy of Atlantis, a reminder that brilliance without humility leads not to enlightenment, but to silence. As the great wave consumed Atlantis and the skies thundered with fury, a handful of survivors clung desperately to life. They had fled the crystal cities, carrying children, fragments of knowledge, and the hope that safety might be found. Yet the forces of nature left them no refuge. Thoth described these final moments as filled with despair and resignation. Families huddled together on trembling cliffs, watching the waters rise inexorably toward them. Ships that had managed to escape the harbors were overturned by violent currents, their passengers cast into the sea. The cries of the people were drowned out by the roar of the ocean, leaving only silence as the waters claimed them. Some survivors attempted chants, invoking the sacred sciences that had once brought harmony, but the energies no longer answered. The crystals were shattered, the machines broken, and the balance irreparably lost. Their voices faded into the storm, powerless against the forces they had once believed they controlled. In these final moments, there was no pride, no arrogance, only the raw truth of mortality. The rulers who had declared themselves gods stood alongside citizens, equally helpless before the fury of nature. The brilliance of Atlantis had been extinguished, and its people faced the end, not as masters of the world, but as mortals humbled by it. Thoth's account makes clear that the survivors' final moments were not only a tragedy, but a lesson. They revealed the cost of arrogance, the futility of power without humility, and the truth that no civilization can defy the balance of nature. The last cries of Atlantis were carried away by the sea, leaving behind silence and the memory of a people who had touched the stars but could not escape their own downfall. Though Atlantis was swallowed by the sea, Thoth ensured that its memory would not vanish entirely. He foresaw the arrogance of the rulers and the destruction it would bring, and so he prepared a hidden record, a testimony preserved beyond the flood. This record was not meant for the Atlanteans themselves, but for future generations, a warning carried across time. Thoth described how he inscribed the truths of Atlantis into sacred writings, concealed in temples and hidden chambers, far from the crystal cities. These writings spoke not only of the brilliance of Atlantean science, but of its downfall, the imbalance that pride had created, and the judgment that followed. He knew that the continent would be erased, but he believed the lesson must endure. The hidden record was more than history, it was guidance. It warned that power without humility leads to ruin, that harmony must be preserved, and that arrogance blinds even the most enlightened. Thoth's words were not simply a chronicle of destruction, but a map for wisdom, a reminder that civilizations rise and fall, according to their respect for balance. Survivors carried fragments of this record to distant lands. In Egypt, Greece, and beyond, whispers of Atlantis became myths, shaped by the remnants of Thoth's testimony. Though the full record remained concealed, its essence lived on in stories of a great civilization lost to the sea. These myths were not accidents, they were echoes of Thoth's hidden work, seeds planted to remind humanity of the cost of pride. Thoth's hidden record ensured that Atlantis would not be forgotten. Though its towers were gone and its sciences drowned, its memory endured as legend, as warning, and as truth. The record was not meant to preserve glory, but to preserve wisdom. The wisdom that balance is the foundation of survival, and that without it, even the greatest civilization will fall. The destruction of Atlantis was not a slow decline, but a sudden collapse. Thoth explained that the speed of the fall was the result of imbalance reaching a critical point. For centuries, Atlanteans built their civilization on harmony with nature. But when pride overtook wisdom, their experiments pushed energies beyond control. Once the balance was broken, the forces of earth, sky, and sea responded all at once. The tremors beneath the land were amplified by machines that resonated with unstable frequencies. The skies, disturbed by chants and vibrations, unleashed storms of unnatural fury. The ocean, restless from misuse of sacred sciences, gathered its strength into the great wave. These forces did not act separately. They converged together, striking Atlantis in a single night of chaos. Thoth described this convergence as the reason Atlantis fell so fast. The rulers believed they could control each element, but they failed to see that all were connected. When one force was disturbed, the others followed. The earth's fractures fed the ocean's unrest. The ocean's surge fed the storm's violence, and the storm's fury fed the collapse of the land. The chain reaction was unstoppable, and the brilliance of Atlantis was erased in hours. The arrogance of the rulers accelerated the destruction. Instead of halting experiments, they pressed forward, amplifying energies that destabilized the continent further. Machines sputtered and failed, crystals shattered, and chants dissolved into silence. Their refusal to listen to warnings ensured that when the collapse began, it unfolded with devastating speed. Thoth's account makes clear that Atlantis fell fast because it had abandoned balance. Pride blinded its people, arrogance silenced caution, and the forces of nature responded with unity. The fall was not gradual because the imbalance was total. Once harmony was broken, destruction came swiftly, leaving no time for escape. Thoth's hidden record was not only a chronicle of Atlantis's brilliance and downfall, it was a message meant for all who would come after. He understood that civilizations rise and fall, not because of ignorance, but because of arrogance. The Atlanteans had mastered sciences that touched the deepest rhythms of nature. Yet they believed themselves gods. Their pride blinded them to warnings, and their refusal to honor balance brought destruction. Thoth's warning was clear. Humanity must never forget that power without humility leads to ruin. Knowledge is a gift, but it demands reverence. The forces of earth, sky, and sea are not tools to be bent endlessly to human will. They are partners in harmony, and when that harmony is broken, the consequences are swift and absolute. He wrote that future generations would face the same temptation, to believe that brilliance makes them untouchable, that mastery of science or technology places them above nature. Atlantis fell so fast because it ignored this truth, and Thoth's record was meant to ensure that others would not repeat the same mistake. The warning for humanity was not a prophecy of doom, but a call to wisdom. It urged people to seek balance in all things, in knowledge, in power, in ambition. It reminded them that civilizations endure not through dominance, but through respect for the forces that sustain life. Thoth's words echo across time as legend, myth, and memory. They remind us that Atlantis was not only a story of destruction, but a mirror held up to humanity. The fall of Atlantis warns that when pride silences humility, when ambition overwhelms wisdom, even the greatest civilization can vanish in a single night. The story of Atlantis does not end with its destruction. Thoth's hidden record was not written merely to preserve memory, but to pose a question that echoes across time. Could it happen again? Civilizations rise with brilliance, mastering sciences, building wonders, and touching the stars. Yet history shows that pride often follows achievement. The Atlanteans believed themselves untouchable, convinced that their mastery of energy placed them above nature. That arrogance blinded them to warnings, and when balance was broken, destruction came swiftly. Thoth warned that humanity in every age faces the same temptation. The pursuit of knowledge is noble, but when ambition overwhelms humility, the seeds of collapse are sown. The forces of earth, sky, and sea remain constant. Though civilizations change, the laws of balance do not. Atlantis fell fast because it ignored these laws. Any society that does the same risks repeating its fate. In our world today, the echoes of Atlantis can be seen in the relentless drive for progress. Technologies grow more powerful, energies are harnessed in ways once unimaginable, and humanity reaches further into the mysteries of the universe. Yet the warning remains. Power without wisdom leads to imbalance. The fall of Atlantis is not only a legend, but a mirror reflecting what happens when pride silences caution. Could it happen again? Thoth's record suggests that it could, not through the same crystals or machines, but through any force misused, any balance ignored. The lesson of Atlantis is timeless. Civilizations endure only when they honor the harmony of nature. When they forget, collapse is not a question of if, but when. And so, the story of Atlantis closes not with certainty, but with a warning carried across centuries. It reminds us that brilliance must be tempered with humility, that progress must walk hand in hand with wisdom, and that balance is the foundation of survival. The tale of Atlantis, with its towers, tremors, storms, and waves, is more than myth. It is a lullaby of caution whispered across time. As the night deepens and silence settles, let the memory of Atlantis drift like a dream. Its fall is a reminder, but its story is also a gift, a call to balance, a plea for humility, and a hope that humanity will choose wisdom over pride. Close your eyes now, and let the ocean's hush carry you into rest. The towers of Atlantis may be gone, but their lesson remains, echoing softly in the stillness of night. Good night.